Today, I'm going to be going over Biology Unit 2.2, which is all going to be about the types of transport. So I'm going to talk about first concentration gradient and how that affects transport. One of the main types of transport is passive transport. Then I'm going to go into osmosis, which is a type of passive transport. And then the second main type of transport, which is active transport. So concentration gradient is what determines transport and how molecules are being transported. So when we say something is moving down the gradient, it means that it's moving from an area with high solutes to an area with low solutes. Here's what I mean by this. If you can see here, this is the membrane, and on one side of the membrane, there's a lot of solutes, and it's going to want to move towards an area where it doesn't have a lot of solutes. So they're really crowded here. And when they're crowded, they want to move away from that crowded area. So this is what they're going to do. And then here, when they're equal, we call this equilibrium. So this action from left to right is what we would call moving down the gradient. If you were to look at this from right to left, so from this way to this way, we would call it moving against the gradient. So this is important because of two types of transport. It's the active transport and passive transport. And concentration gradient determines what kind of transport the molecule can perform. So if a molecule is performing passive transport, it's moving down the gradient, which means that it's going to want to get away from that crowded space. This means that the action requires no energy because it's really easy for that molecule to travel across the membrane and go towards an area where it's less crowded, right? It's their natural instinct, so it's not going to take any energy. Diffusion is also another type of passive transport. And the difference between those two is that diffusion can happen with or without a cell membrane. So diffusion happens in the air all the time, but oftentimes diffusion and passive transport will be used interchangeably. So osmosis is a specific type of passive transport, and it's only meant for water. So water is so important that it has its own type of passive transport. So every time we talk about water undergoing transport, we usually call it osmosis. So this is an example of how water undergoes transport. So right here, you can see there's a membrane, and it's semi-permeable, which means that it's going to allow water to go through, but salt molecules is not going to be able to go through. So as you can see, because salt is a solute, there's a lot of solute here. And what the water is going to do is it's going to fill up on this side to where technically, even though there's more solutes here, they have the equal number because of the high water concentration here. So the concentration of solute to water ratio is the same on either side. All right, so there's three types of possible situations that can come about due to osmosis, and we call this tonicity. So there's three types. There's isotonic, hypertonic, and hypotonic. So isotonic is the first stage, and this is the stage that most of our mammal cells will reside in, and that just means that the equal amount of water is going in and the equal amount of water is going out, which means that the cell will stay in the same size. So there's no net gain or net loss. Hypertonic, on the other hand, is when a lot of water is leaving the cell, which means that the cell is going to kind of shrink up like this. So this happens when there's a lot of solutes outside of the cell. Because there's so many solutes outside of the cell, as you can see here, the water is going to want to go outside of the cell in order to balance that osmosis. So hypotonic is the exact opposite. It's when there's a lot of solute particles inside of the cell, and the water is going to want to flood in, and that's going to mean that the water is going to make the cell grow bigger. Hypertonic and hypotonic is very dangerous for typical animal cells, but for plant cells, they want to be in that hypotonic stage because they have that cell wall. Their cell wall can contain all of that water, and it's really good for the plant if they're rigid. They don't want to lose all of that water. So most plants will want to be in a hypotonic situation, while our cells tend to be in an isotonic situation. So there's one type of passive transport that we call facilitated diffusion. And this is just the diffusion with the aid of proteins. So what we mean by this is, if you remember from my last video, some molecules are hydrophilic, which means that they are unable to enter through the membrane because the membrane has a hydrophobic center, which does not allow hydrophilic molecules to enter. So even if a molecule is going down its gradient to where they could technically pass from a crowded region to a non-crowded region, they still can't get past the membrane, which is where facilitated diffusion comes through. So facilitated diffusion will use protein channels like this, and say there's a lot of solute particles here, but only like one solute particle here. So what the solute particle will do is it will travel through here and over here. And because you're still going down its concentration gradient, it's still considered passive transport. So this is the next type of transport. It's active transport, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It requires energy, and this is where a molecule is moving against its gradient. So as you can see here, like I showed you earlier, if we look at this from right to left, it would be, this is equilibrium, and say these solute particles wanted to go over here, but it's already really crowded over here. So that means that when it's going over, it's going to require some amount of energy. So it's moving from an area of high amount to an area of low amount. The active transport also goes through proteins, just like facilitated diffusion, but the difference is it's moving against its gradient, which means it's going to require energy, and most of that energy is going to be powered through ATP. Another type of transport that they will do is called co-transport, where they will transport one molecule against the gradient and one molecule down the gradient. So what I mean by this is that sometimes, say there's a lot of solutes on this side, a lot of water molecules on this side, and water is going to want to go here where it's less crowded. So that's going to be passive transport. But let's say there's another molecule here. Let's say this is calcium, and calcium wants to go to a crowded region. So how that's going to work is water is going to move here, and calcium is going to move up. And during that process, because water is moving down its gradient and calcium is moving against its gradient, they will kind of help each other along the way. They will kind of exchange that energy to where this active transport process won't be as costly in ATP. So that's all about the transport that I'm going to be talking about. I really recommend watching my last video to see how these channel proteins actually work, because